Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Renu Tyagi from Department of Anthropology, University of Delhi. Today I am going to speak on the module Ecological Adaptation among Tribal Population. The learning objectives of the module include number 1, the introduction, information about ecological adaptation among tribal populations. It includes the basic concept of tribe and forestry and tribal and rural adaptation. The study of this module enables the students at postgraduate level to understand the climate change, adaptation and its implementation in Indian country like rights, environmental justice, tribal sovereignty, connection to the land and traditional environmental knowledge. First of all, I am going to talk about the introduction. It has been simply understood that ecology and tribal society have a very core relationship. Tribalism only sustain if ecology sustain. Displacement of tribals in various parts of this universe took place only when disturbances brought in the ecological system in the particular tribal settled area. No tribal can survive without their engagement in forest, river, mountains, animals and overall ecological system. Tribals feels more comfortable when they live with their ecosystem. On the other hand, it is also true to say that every society needs to change according to the change of the universe and nature, but that changes should not be on the cost of the life and livelihood. We have a long history within India and throughout this world that once any disturbance took place, a mass tribal displacement took place, inbound or outbound. In the name of development and better life, tribal sacrificed more than any other ethnic group in this universe. According to the census 2011, the total population of scheduled caste, that is ST in India, constitute 8.6% of the total population of the country. 91.7% of them live in rural areas, whereas only 8.3% inhabit urban areas. Now we will briefly discuss about tribes and forestry. Forests are the vital economic and cultural resources for many tribal populations of the world. Climate change has the potential to both the health of the forest across the country and increase their productivity. For tribes whose culture, tradition and ways of their life may be heavily dependent on forest resources, it is important to build an understanding of how climate change may impact the forest and other ecosystems. Climate change will affect temperature and moisture regimes that have important implications for tribal forestry. Every region will be affected differently, but in general it is likely that temperature will increase and precipitation patterns will become more extreme in most part of the country. Tribes can prepare for climatic threat by carrying out periodic forest assessments that evaluate observed climate change impact and species climate change vulnerability. The Indian Forest Management Assessment Team, which is comprised of the representatives from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Intertribal Timber Council, developed 10-year report in 1993 and explained in 2003 evaluating the conditions of Indian forest and the effectiveness of tribal forest management strategies on a national level. These assessments, while not focused on the climate change impact, provide insight into the evolving challenges faced by tribal forest managers. Similar assessments with a specific focus on climate change impact can be spearheaded at regional or tribal level. Now, I will briefly talk about the adaptability. The human body readily responds to changing environmental stresses in a variety of biological and cultural ways. We can acclimatize to a wide range of temperature and humidity when traveling to high altitude. Our bodies adjust so that our cells still receive sufficient oxygen. We also are constantly responding to physiological ways to internal and external stresses such as bacterial and viral infections, air and water pollution, dietary imbalances and overcrowding. This ability to rapidly adapt to the varying environmental condition has made it possible for us to survive in most regions of the world. We live successfully in humid tropical forest, harsh desert, Arctic wastelands and even densely populated cities with considerable amount of pollution. Most of the animals and plant species are restricted to one or relatively few environments by their more limited adaptability. Humans normally respond to environment stresses in 4 ways. Number 1, genetic change. Number 2, developmental adjustment. Number 3, acclimatization. And number 4, cultural practices and technology. The first 3 are biological responses, whereas the last 3 occur during our lifetime without further genetic change. Now, I would like to discuss about tribe and rural adaptation. Roughly 5% of the world population, that is 370 million, are indigenous tribal people who occupy about 25% of the global and make up around 15% of the extremely poor, as per the World Bank report in 2016. These indigenous populations are heavily dependent on the natural resources for their survival. The impact on the tribal communities is likely to be further accelerated by their relatively higher reliance on the natural support system, making them among the most vulnerable groups to climate change and variability. There are a number of ways possible for mitigating climate change vulnerability of smallholders like tribal communities that rely on rain-fed farming system, such as diversification of agricultural livelihood system. Prior information about seasonal climate forecast for farmers, index insurance where payouts are based on meteorological indexes correlated with agricultural losses, has worked well for smallholders and tribal communities in India and Mexico. Social protection could be another option and includes providing of farm income, cash transfers and transformation of societal relation to address underlying social and political vulnerability. Asset transfer to rural people and tribal communities that have been affected by climate stresses is a common coping strategy and can be managed either by cash credit or livestock and poultry. Building assets can help vulnerable to increase their resilience and contribute to social protection. Ethiopia's Productivity Safety Net Program (PSNP) has provided seasonal employment in public sector in exchange for food and cash. This have reduced the seasonal vulnerability of rural poor tribal communities for food insecurity and protected the household assets. In India, tribal people make up 8.6% or 104 millions of the total population as per the report of Ministry of Tribal Affairs in 2013. The relative level of vulnerability in India differs between states, geographical location and social groups within the same region. The differences in vulnerability are attributable to substantial variation in orography, climate conditions and ecosystems, as well as differences in the social structure, economic status and requirement of different communities. Various adaptation actions have been implemented to strengthen the adaptive capacity of vulnerable communities. The Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, that is MGNREGA, is one such incentive-based program that creates employment opportunities by constructing productive, durable assets at village level. The Act was initially introduced in 2006 in the 200 least developed district in India and has since been expanded to all 619 districts in the country as per the report by Ministry of Rural Development in 2016. NREGA aims to enhance livelihood opportunities in rural areas by guaranteeing at least 100 days employment within a financial year to an adult member of a rural household who is willing to volunteer to do unskilled manual work. NREGA provides an opportunity for the most vulnerable group in societies, that is poor and marginalized people, to gain employment in a legal framework which help them achieve social empowerment. Since its inception, NREGA has contributed to agricultural production, especially in semi and regions of rural India. This has been accomplished through creation and rejuvenation of assets related to water harvesting and conservation, which have led to increased access to irrigation for marginal farmers who would otherwise be dependent on rain for agriculture. The increase in agricultural production and water availability has enhanced the livelihood opportunities and standard of living of rural population across India. Improved rural infrastructure, road and sanitation measures, and an enhanced natural resource base have reduced the vulnerability of poor and marginalized people. Now I am going to talk about the indigenous adaptation in the face of climate change. The impact of climate change are now clear. Within the country, locations and regions are increasingly considering adaptation strategies in the face of negative impact of climate change. Adaptation efforts are most critical at the local level because uncertainty remains as to how exactly climate change may impact particular locality. Adaptive governance provides the necessary flexibility to regulate in the face of such uncertainty. Tribes are not immune from the impact of climate change, though many tribal communities contribute little, if anything, to the problem of climate change. They are uniquely vulnerable to its impact given their location and connection to the land. As a result, tribes, just like other local and regional governments, are increasingly looking at adaptive strategies to increase resiliency in the face of climate change. In some instances, natives are at the forefront of these changes and have been forced to adapt. This module takes a closer look at the tribal adaptation plan in the hope of identifying emerging trends. Now, I will elaborate on climate change adaptation and its implementation in India. As we have discussed earlier, tribal governments are not immune to the impact of climate change and have been working to develop their own adaptation strategies. Before exploring the specific adaptation strategies of various tribes, however, this section provides a brief introduction into what adaptation is generally. Following this brief introduction, the section considers factors that tribal communities may want to consider in developing their own adaptation strategies. Now let us have a brief introduction to adaptation. Today's strategies to cope with climate change can generally be categorized into one of the two groups: adaptation or mitigation. Policymakers in 1990s and early 2000s largely focused on mitigation policies. For a variety of reasons, however, mitigation effort proved largely unsuccessful in abating the impact of climate change. As a result, comprehensive national strategy that successfully reduced greenhouse gas emission to level thought to be adequate to arrest climate change quite clearly not around the political corner. Accordingly, advocates, scientists and politicians are increasingly considering adaptive strategies to cope with climate change. Adaptation efforts differ from mitigation effort in several respects. One of these differences is that adaptation strategies are apt to be localized and they may present opportunities for relatively quick action at local level. Ruhi, who has written widely on the subject of climate change adaptation, explains the goal of adaptation planning. First, it is to effectively and equitably manage the harms and benefits of climate change while mitigation does its work. Second, it is to supply interim strategies to put us in a position to resume long-term planning for a sustainable development when climate change is over. Ultimately, however, adaptation should not be the sole focus of any community. In part, this is because some communities are more vulnerable to climate change and less able to adapt. For example, scholars caution against policies focusing only on adaptation. Caution may be warranted because such policies have a tendency to hit the poor the hardest, as the poor generally have the most difficulty in adapting due to lack of resources. So, successful adaptation is a product of socio-economic factors as well as physical environmental factors. Ultimately, in the many countries, because poor and marginalized communities without sufficient financial and social resources will face significant adaptation challenges. Kaswan concludes that equity consideration should play a vital role in emerging US adaptation initiative in order to ensure that indigenous communities or tribal communities engage in successful adaptation. It is helpful to utilize an integrated method of adaptation that takes into consideration ecological, social and economic factors. Yet, communities cannot be treated the same by adaptation planners because such actions would result in inequity and because there is wide diversity amongst tribal communities. Furthermore, in the case of tribal communities, it is also crucial that sovereignty, the right to self-determination, human rights, environmental justice, the unique connection to and the environment and traditional environmental knowledge possessed by many tribal communities be taken into consideration. There are two types of response orientation to adapting to climate change, proactive or reactive. For the most part, the adaptation strategies discussed are proactive. For many indigenous populations, however, reactive strategies are necessary. For example, several indigenous villages in Alaska are already in imminent danger of flooding and erosion, including Kivalina, Koyukuk, Nuiyotok and Shishmaref. At the end of the day, climate change will require people to develop new strategies for avoiding and recovering from its harm and capturing and harnessing its benefit. Adaptation inevitably results in winners and losers as resources are reallocated in the face of climate change. Now, let us see what is indigenous adaptation. With a generalized background in climate change adaptation now in hand, this portion consider what adaptation strategies are utilized by the indigenous people, which might include and looks at what some tribal communities are actually considering in their adaptation planning. As indigenous communities consider and implement adaptive strategies, a question arises as to who will be responsible for crafting such adaptive strategies. In India, it is not uncommon for up to 3 different sovereigns to play a role in regulating and adjudicating the tribal community, the tribe, the federal government and the relevant state government. Ideally, tribal government should be primarily responsible for making decisions related to climate change. adaptation. However, given the uncertainty of the ultimate decision maker, this section develops factors that should be taken into consideration by any decision maker acting within indigenous communities. Specifically, some factors that tribes may want to take into consideration include international human rights norms, environmental justice, and tribal sovereignty. The unique connection that many indigenous communities possess with their land and environment and traditional environmental knowledge. Now let's see human rights. Tribe developing adaptive strategies may want to consider the international human rights framework because the negative impact of climate change have the potential to impact human rights, especially of indigenous communities. Numerous scholars have called on government to assist indigenous people with adaptation. Saucy concluded that an international human rights approach is appropriate to address the impact of climate change on indigenous people because domestic solutions will not adequately address such impact. Notably, a human rights approach may require a different method, as some indigenous communities may consider such rights like those related to subsistence to be communal right in considering the application of human rights norms to indigenous adaptation. It is important to distinguish sovereignty from self-determination, as indigenous communities may have rights based on both. Sovereignty is a substantive legal status, while self-determination is a political right that stems from an underlying moral claim. In considering what law applies to their adaptive efforts and specifically thinking about international human rights, tribe may want to consider the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, that is UNDRIP. UNDRIP addresses international expectations regarding the basic rights enjoyed by indigenous people. Although not a binding legal document, this is helpful in providing a baseline as to what the United Nations and its member states believe are the rights or should be of the indigenous people. Of the particular importance here are the UNDRIP's statements with regard to indigenous self-determination, property and redress. Let's see what is environmental justice. Tribes developing adaptation strategies may also want to consider environmental justice because indigenous communities are environmental justice communities. The term environmental justice has been used to highlight the distributional impact of the dominant society's environmental decision-making process on disadvantaged communities, including the poor and the racial minorities. Even before climate change came into the picture, an environmental justice then emerged around the inequitable burdens the poor and people of color have sustained in terms of disproportionate exposure to pollution, proximity to industrial site and contaminated land, and limited access to environmental amenities. In this regard, environmental justice is certainly applicable to indigenous people who have contributed little, if anything, to the problem of climate change, but are disproportionately bearing its negative impact. Climate change and its impact on indigenous people are environmental justice issues, as the disproportion between tribal contribution to global warming and negative impact on tribe qualifies as an environmental justice issue. Ultimately, assuming the tribal community is a full participant in the development of its adaptation plan, it may be possible that adaptation law can play a significant role in furthering climate justice. Now let's see tribal sovereignty. Another factor to be considered when developing tribal adaptive strategies is tribal sovereignty. Notably, tribal self-determination mandates that adaptation strategies in Indian context to be decided by the governing tribes. Tribal self-determination and sovereignty demand that indigenous communities are the decision makers in adaptation planning as explained above under international human rights law. Moreover, adaptive measures, more so than mitigation measures, can be developed on a local level, which calls for increased participation by local governments, here indigenous governments. Federally recognized tribes in the United States differ from other communities that may be impacted by climate change because of their status as sovereigns. Tribe legal rights flow as an initial matter from their sovereignty and their related historical management of the land and resources. Tribes exist as entities separate from state and federal governments. A myriad of historical legal developments led to this separateness, although the nature of the tribal sovereignty has changed since the founding of United States of America. Tribal sovereignty remains in the place today, consistent with the necessity to recognize indigenous sovereignty to prevent injustice as well as international human rights norms. Any adaptation policy applicable to indigenous people must provide for broad participation by indigenous community. Now let us see the connection to the land. Finally, adaptation planning for indigenous communities should also have into consideration the unique cultural and spiritual connection that many indigenous communities have with their land and environment. Sauce explains that the importance of land is particularly vital to many indigenous communities. There is no other place that indigenous people can go and still continue to practice their unique life ways and cultural practices. Geographical location is essential to indigenous identity. History has demonstrated time and again that the forcible removal of indigenous communities from their traditional lands, resource and the life ways result in immeasurable harm. Beyond legal connections to the land, as many as 58 indigenous people also have a strong spiritual and cultural connection to the land upon which they reside or to their traditional homelands. For many indigenous people, their spirituality is intimately connected to the earth and their environment. As the effect of climate change ravage their environment, indigenous people may experience both physical and spiritual loss connected with the negative impact on the environment. As an example of this connection, the Swinomish Climate Change Initiative Climate Adaptation Action Plan discusses the link between tribal culture and community health. Similarly, because of the close spiritual connection that many indigenous people have with the environment, their culture and traditions are also intimately connected to the larger environment. It is commonplace in many indigenous communities for annual tradition and customs to be tied to certain environmental occurrences. As climate change threatens to dramatically change the environment, culture and tradition may also therefore be threatened. Now let us see traditional environmental knowledge. Related to this strong connection to land and place that many indigenous communities possess is traditional environmental knowledge, that is TEC. TEC is used to describe a system of knowledge, practice and belief that describes the relationship of living being and their environment. This system has evolved through tradition as well as adaptive processes over time and have been passed from generation to generation by cultural transmission. Accordingly, because of the strong connection many indigenous communities have to a particular land and place, such communities have developed TEC related to a particular place. Accordingly, because TEC traditionally differs from Western or scientific knowledge, it may be a valuable addition to adaptation planning. Because of the reason explained by Professor Burkett, flexibility, knowledge based on the close connection to the land, better guidance for increased resiliency, tribes working to develop adaptation plans may wish to incorporate their own TEC into such plans. Now let's summarize the modules. Having generally introduced the concept of climate change adaptation and then looked specifically at adaptation plans developed by tribes, it has been simply understood that ecology and tribal society have a very core relationship. It is also true to say that every society needs to change according to the change of the universe and nature, but that change should not be on the cost of life and livelihood. The total population of the ST in India is constituting 8.6% of the total population of the country. The proportion of the ST to the total population of the state union territories is highest in Mizoram, followed by Lakshadweep. Forests are the vital economic and cultural resources for many tribal populations of the world. Climate change will affect the temperature and moisture regime that have important implications for tribal forestry. Tribe can prepare for climate threats by carrying out periodic forest assessments that evaluate observed climate change impact and species climate change vulnerability. The human body readily responds to changing environmental stresses in a variety of biological and cultural ways. Humans normally respond to the environmental stresses in 4 ways: genetic change, developmental adjustment, acclimatization, cultural practices, and technology. There are a number of ways possible for mitigating climate vulnerability of smallholders. Various adaptation actions have been implemented to strengthen the adaptive capacity of vulnerable communities. The Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, that is NREGA, is one such incentive-based program that creates employment by constructing productive, durable assets at village level. Furthermore, ecological regeneration or rejuvenation of NSS generates a number of tangible and intangible benefits to the community in a sustainable way. The impact of climate change are now clear. Tribal governments are not immune to the impact of climate change and have been working to develop their own adaptation strategies. Today, strategies to cope with climate change can generally be categorized into 1 or 2 groups of adaptation or mitigation. Adaptation efforts differ from mitigation efforts in several respects. In order to ensure that indigenous communities or tribal communities engage in successful adaptation, it is helpful to utilize an integrated method of adaptation that takes into consideration ecological, social, and economic factors. There are 2 types of response orientation to adapting to climate change, that is proactive or reactive. Some factors that tribes may want to take into consideration include international human rights norms, environmental justice, and tribal sovereignty, the unique connection that many indigenous communities possess with their land and environment and traditional environmental knowledge. Thank you.